Grizzly bear, trapped in the woods, begs, "This human baby for help." What happened next will shock you. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Every bit of your support helps us create even more amazing stories for you. The morning sun filtered through the dense pines, casting dappled shadows across the wooden porch of the Thomas family cabin. Nestled at the edge of Blackwater Forest, the modest dwelling stood as a testament to their love for solitude and nature. Inside, 10-month-old Emma Thomas sat on a patchwork quilt spread across the porch floor, her chubby fingers exploring the texture of pine cones her mother had collected for her amusement. Sarah Thomas hummed softly as she hung freshly washed clothes on the line stretching from the cabin to a nearby oak tree. "I'll just be around the corner, sweet pea," she called to Emma, disappearing momentarily behind the cabin to retrieve more laundry from the basket she'd left there. Emma babbled happily in response, her bright blue eyes wide with curiosity at the world around her. Though she had only recently mastered the art of crawling, her determination to explore knew no bounds. The cabin door remained open behind her, the screen door latched, but allowing the forest sounds to drift inside. A low, pained growl suddenly cut through the morning's tranquility. The sound was so unexpected that even the birds fell silent. Emma paused her exploration, her small head turning toward the tree line where the cabin yard met the wilds of Blackwater Forest. The growl came again, followed by a strange rattling noise and what sounded almost like a whimper. Emma's curiosity outweighed any instinctive fear. She rocked forward onto her hands and knees and began crawling toward the edge of the porch, drawn by the unusual sounds. As she reached the steps, her gaze landed on a sight that would have sent adults running in terror. A massive grizzly bear, its fur a mix of brown and silver, was trapped just 20 yards from the cabin. The bear's massive paw was caught in what appeared to be an illegal snare trap, the metal cutting cruelly into its flesh. Blood matted the fur around its leg, and each time it pulled, the trap's chain rattled against the forest floor. The magnificent creature, normally the undisputed ruler of these woods, was now rendered helpless and vulnerable. As if sensing it was being watched, the bear's head swung toward the cabin porch. Its dark eyes, filled with pain and fear, locked onto Emma's innocent gaze. Time seemed to stand still as predator and prey, wilderness and civilization, power and innocence connected across the short distance. Then something extraordinary happened. The bear stopped struggling. It tilted its massive head, eyes still fixed on the tiny human before it. A soft, almost pleading whimper escaped its throat, a sound so uncharacteristic of the fearsome predator that it seemed to transform the very nature of the encounter. Emma responded with a curious coo, her face breaking into a toothless smile. Unaware of danger, unburdened by learned fear, she saw only another creature in distress. With the simple, pure compassion that only the very young can possess, she began to move. First, one hand forward, then a knee, then another hand, crawling down the porch steps and toward the suffering giant, leaving the safety of the cabin behind. The forest held its breath as innocence approached raw, wounded power, neither aware of how impossible their connection should have been. Behind the cabin, Sarah continued hanging laundry, humming softly, blissfully unaware that her baby girl was crawling toward one of nature's most dangerous predators, and that what would happen next would defy everything she believed about the natural world. The bear watched Emma's approach, its massive body still except for the rapid rise and fall of its chest. Its eyes, intelligent and wary, never left the tiny figure moving steadily toward it across the pine needle-covered ground. Each time Emma's hands touched the earth, they left small imprints in the soft forest floor, tiny markers of her journey into danger, Wildlife experts would later say it was impossible. Experienced hunters would shake their heads in disbelief. But on that quiet morning in Blackwater Forest, as sunlight streamed through the canopy above, the impossible was unfolding moment by moment, breath by breath. Emma, too young to walk alone but driven by something deeper than fear, continued her determined crawl toward the trapped grizzly bear. The distance between them shrank with each movement, 20 feet, 15 feet, 10 feet, while behind the cabin her mother remained unaware of the extraordinary encounter taking place just yards from where she worked. The bear's eyes reflected something no one would have expected to see in a wounded wild animal: recognition, desperation, and what looked almost like hope. As Emma drew closer, the bear made that unusual sound again. Not a growl of warning or a roar of aggression, but a soft whimper that seemed to reach out across the gulf that separated their worlds. What happened next would change everything the residents of Pinecrest County thought they understood about the wilderness that surrounded their homes, and about the boundaries between humans and the wild creatures with whom they shared the forest. Somewhere in the distance, a twig snapped. A bird took flight, and Emma's tiny hand reached out toward the trapped bear's massive paw. In the quiet kitchen of the Thomas cabin, Sarah wrung excess water from a white bedsheet, draping it over her shoulder as she reached into the laundry basket for another item. She listened for Emma's babbling, reassured by the occasional coos coming from the front porch. Single parenting while her husband Jack worked 2-week shifts at the North Star mining operation was challenging, but she'd developed a system that worked for them both. The telephone's shrill ring broke her concentration. Wiping her hands on her jeans, Sarah crossed to the wall-mounted phone. "Hello?" she answered, stretching the cord so she could peek through the window toward the porch. From her angle, she could just make out the edge of Emma's patchwork quilt. "Sarah." "It's Ranger Miller." The familiar voice of the local forest ranger came through the line. "Just calling to give you a heads up. We've had reports of illegal traps being set in your area. Jack asked me to keep an eye on you two while he's away." Sarah's breath caught. "What kind of traps?" "Nasty ones. Wire snares mostly. We found 2 already this morning on the north side of your property. I'm heading over to check the eastern boundary now." "That's awful," Sarah replied, her fingers tightening around the receiver. "Those are illegal, aren't they?" "Very. And dangerous. Not just to wildlife, but to anyone walking through the woods." His voice lowered. "There's also been reports of a large male grizzly in the area. Probably came down from the high country looking for food before hibernation. Keep Emma close to the house, okay?" A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "I always do. Thanks for the warning, Dale." "No problem. I should be by your place in about 20 minutes. Just stay alert until then." As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized she could no longer hear Emma's babbling. The sudden silence sent a spike of maternal alarm through her body. "Emma," she called, hurrying toward the front of the cabin. "Emma, sweetie." The porch came into view, sunlight streaming across the weathered boards, illuminating the empty quilt where her daughter had been playing just minutes before. The screen door was still latched, but there was enough space beneath it for a determined baby to squeeze through. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she flung open the door and rushed onto the porch. "Emma!" she shouted, panic rising in her throat as her eyes scanned the yard. The sight that greeted her at the forest's edge froze her in place. 20 yards away, her baby girl was crawling directly toward an enormous grizzly bear. The massive creature was pulling against something on its paw, its attention fixed entirely on the approaching infant. "Oh, God," Sarah whispered, her body paralyzed with terror. Any sudden movement could trigger the bear's predatory instincts. Any loud sound could startle it into attacking. Her baby was crawling straight toward one of nature's most perfect killing machines, and Sarah had no idea how to save her without making the situation infinitely worse. Time slowed to an excruciating crawl as Sarah watched her daughter move closer to the bear, inch by agonizing inch. And then she noticed something that didn't make sense. The bear wasn't displaying any signs of aggression. It wasn't standing to intimidate, wasn't showing its teeth. Instead, it was watching Emma with what almost looked like curiosity. That's when Sarah saw the trap. The cruel metal teeth of a snare had clamped around the bear's front paw, tethering it to a chain staked into the ground. Blood matted the fur around the wound, and each time the animal pulled against the restraint, it winced with pain. The bear was trapped, and somehow her 10-month-old daughter was crawling toward it without an ounce of fear. "Emma," Sarah called softly, taking one tentative step forward. "Emma, baby, come to Mommy." But Emma didn't turn. She continued her determined journey toward the suffering animal, her chubby hands reaching forward with each movement, closing the distance between innocence and danger with every second that passed. What happened next would be the subject of conversation throughout Pinecrest County for years to come. An encounter that defied explanation, a moment that would change how Sarah, and eventually everyone who heard the story, understood the connection between humans and the wild creatures with whom they shared the world. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting golden light across the forest floor, Emma reached the trapped grizzly bear. And the bear, its dark eyes reflecting pain, and something far more complex than simple animal instinct, did something no one could have predicted. It lowered its massive head toward the tiny human child who had dared to approach it in its moment of vulnerability, and waited. Emma's tiny palm hovered just inches from the bear's injured paw. Sarah stood frozen on the porch, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would startle the massive predator. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to rush forward, to snatch her baby away from danger, but her rational mind knew such a sudden movement could trigger the bear's defensive reactions. "Please," she whispered, the word carrying no sound. "Please don't hurt her." The bear's nostrils flared as it scented Emma, its massive head lowering until it was almost level with hers. Emma, displaying none of the fear any adult would feel, made a delighted gurgling sound and reached for the animal's snout. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a scream, but instead of the violent reaction she anticipated, the bear remained perfectly still, allowing the baby's fingers to brush against its nose. The gentleness of the interaction was so incongruous with everything Sarah knew about wild predators that she wondered momentarily if she was hallucinating the entire scene. Emma babbled happily, patting the bear's muzzle as if it were no more dangerous than a stuffed toy. Then, with the random determination of a baby exploring the world, she shifted her attention to the cruel metal trap that imprisoned the bear's paw. "No, Emma," Sarah called, her voice strangled with fear. "Don't touch that." But Emma was already reaching for the snare, her curiosity drawing her to the strange object. The bear watched, its intelligent eyes following her movements. When Emma's fingers touched the trap's mechanism, the bear flinched but made no aggressive move. What happened next would later be explained away by wildlife experts as coincidence, by local ministers as divine intervention, and by skeptics as exaggeration. But Sarah, watching from the porch, would never doubt what she saw. As Emma's small fingers pushed against the trap's release mechanism, there came a metallic click. The jaws of the snare, which had resisted the bear's tremendous strength, sprang open at the baby's touch. Whether Emma had accidentally hit the release, or whether the trap had been weakened by the bear's struggles was impossible to determine. The bear pulled its injured paw free, blood matting the fur where the metal teeth had pierced skin. It stood motionless for a moment, towering over the tiny human who had, impossibly, freed it from captivity. Sarah's breath caught. Now unrestrained, the bear could easily strike out at Emma. Her muscles tensed, preparing to run to her child despite knowing she would be too late. The bear lowered its head once more, its massive snout gently nudging Emma's shoulder. The baby giggled, reaching up to pat its face again. Then, with a grace that belied its enormous size, the bear stepped backward, maintaining eye contact with Emma as it retreated. 3 steps, 5, 10. At the edge of the forest, the bear paused, looking back at the tiny human sitting in the dappled sunlight. It made a soft chuffing sound, not a growl, not a roar, but something Sarah would later describe as almost like a thank you, before turning and disappearing into the underbrush. Emma watched it go, then turned toward her mother, her face lighting up with recognition. "Mama," she called, using one of the few words in her limited vocabulary. Sarah's paralysis broke. She raced down the porch steps and across the yard, scooping Emma into her arms and holding her so tightly that the baby squirmed in protest. "You're okay," Sarah sobbed, running her hands over Emma to check for injuries. "You're okay. You're okay. You're okay." Emma seemed entirely unperturbed by the encounter, babbling happily and pointing toward the forest where the bear had vanished. Sarah turned in that direction, half expecting to see the animal returning, but the woods were still. Clutching Emma to her chest, Sarah hurried back to the cabin, latching the door firmly behind them. She reached for the phone, her hands shaking so badly, she misdialed twice before successfully connecting with the ranger station. "Dale," she said when Ranger Miller answered. "You need to come now. There was a bear. Emma was—" She broke off, realizing how insane her story would sound. "Sarah? What's happened? Are you and Emma okay?" The concern in his voice was evident. "We're fine. We're okay. But there was a bear in a trap at the edge of our property. Emma got out of the house somehow and—" Sarah took a deep breath. "Just come, please, and bring your first aid kit. Not for us. For the bear, if you can find it. It was injured by the trap." She hung up before he could question her further, holding Emma tightly as she sank into a kitchen chair. Her baby looked up at her with innocent blue eyes, completely unaware of the miracle that had just occurred, or how close she had come to death. Outside, the forest had returned to its normal rhythms. Birds sang, squirrels chattered, and somewhere in the depths of the woods, a wounded grizzly bear made its way toward the high country, carrying with it the memory of small, gentle hands and an encounter that defied the natural order of things. What happened in that clearing would change Sarah's understanding of the wilderness forever. But the true impact of that extraordinary connection between a baby and a bear would not become clear until many years later, when Emma Thomas would once again find herself face to face with the creatures of Blackwater Forest, and discover that some bonds once formed can never truly be broken. Rangers combed Blackwater Forest for 3 days following the incident. They found 7 more illegal traps, dismantled them all, and discovered a blood trail leading from the Thomas property deep into the northern wilderness. The wounded bear, however, eluded them. "It's probably for the best," Ranger Miller told Sarah as they sat on her porch, watching Emma play safely behind the newly installed child-proof gate. "That bear crossed paths with your daughter and showed remarkable restraint. But it's still a wild animal, Sarah, still dangerous." Sarah nodded, cradling her mug of coffee between her palms. "I know that, Dale, I do. But you didn't see it. The way it looked at her, the way it thanked her." Dale shifted uncomfortably. In the 20 years he'd worked these forests, he'd never heard of a grizzly behaving the way Sarah described. "Animals don't think like we do," he said gently. "What you saw was probably just relief at being freed from the trap." "Maybe," Sarah conceded, though she didn't believe it. The connection she'd witnessed between her daughter and the bear went beyond simple animal behavior. There had been recognition there, understanding. "Jack's coming home tomorrow," she said, changing the subject. "I haven't told him yet. Not everything, anyway." Dale nodded. Probably wise. Any father hearing his baby girl crawled up to a grizzly might have a heart attack on the spot. They both laughed, the tension easing somewhat. But as Dale left, promising to increase patrols near their property, Sarah found herself standing at the forest's edge, staring into the dense pines. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carried away by the gentle breeze. "For not hurting her. For seeing her innocence." Whether she was speaking to the bear, to the forest itself, or to some higher power that had protected her daughter, Sarah couldn't have said. But as she turned back toward the cabin, she felt a strange sense of peace. As if the wilderness that had always seemed so threatening had revealed itself, in one miraculous moment, to be capable of compassion. Inside, Emma napped peacefully, one tiny hand clutching a tuft of coarse brown fur that Sarah had found caught in her overalls. She had meant to dispose of it, this physical reminder of how close she'd come to losing her daughter. Instead, she'd placed it in a small jar on the mantelpiece, evidence of an impossible connection between innocence and wildness that even she sometimes struggled to believe had really happened. That night, as moonlight filtered through the cabin windows, Sarah dreamed of dark, intelligent eyes watching from the forest edge. Of her daughter, grown tall and strong, walking fearlessly among the creatures of Blackwater Forest. And of a massive grizzly bear, its injured paw healed, standing guard over them both. It was just a dream, of course, the product of an overwrought imagination and a mother's lingering fear. But in the years to come, as Emma grew and the forest revealed more of its secrets, Sarah would remember that dream and wonder if perhaps it had been something more. A glimpse of a future shaped by one extraordinary encounter between a baby who knew no fear and a bear that had, for one miraculous moment, responded with something very much like compassion. The story of Emma and the bear would be told and retold throughout Pinecrest County, growing more fantastical with each telling until it became local legend. Most dismissed it as exaggeration or the hysterical perception of a frightened mother. But Sarah knew what she had seen, and every year on the anniversary of that day, she and Emma would leave a basket of fresh honey and berries at the forest's edge, a thank you to a creature that had defied its nature and spared what was most precious to her. What no one could have predicted, however, was that the true ending to the story had not yet been written, that 15 years later, when Wildfire swept through Blackwater Forest, the connection forged between a child and a bear would once again manifest in ways that would leave even the staunchest skeptics questioning everything they thought they knew about the natural world, and about the capacity of animals to remember an act of kindness across the vast divide of years. But that was a story for another time. For now, Sarah watched over her sleeping daughter, grateful for each precious breath, each tiny movement. Outside, the forest stood silent, sentinel around their cabin, its mysteries intact, its wildness temporarily held at bay. And somewhere in the high country, a wounded bear found shelter in a remote cave, curled its massive body around its injured paw, and drifted into healing sleep, carrying with it the memory of small hands, gentle touch, and unexpected freedom granted by the most unlikely of saviors. 15 years later, the summer heat pressed down on Blackwater Forest like a heavy blanket, turning the usually cool mountain air thick and oppressive. Emma Thomas wiped sweat from her brow as she hiked the familiar trail leading from their cabin to Crystal Creek. At 15, she had grown into a quiet, thoughtful young woman with her mother's determination and her father's love for the wilderness. "Wait up, Em," called a voice from behind. Her best friend, Lily Morgan, scrambled up the steep incline, her dark ponytail bouncing with each step. "Not all of us were literally raised by the forest, you know." Emma grinned, pausing to let her friend catch up. "Sorry. I forget not everyone knows these trails like I do." Ever since the story of her encounter with the bear had spread through Pinecrest County, Emma had been something of a local celebrity. The Bear Whisperer, some called her, though Emma herself had no memory of the event. She knew it only through her mother's telling and the strange looks people sometimes gave her in town, a mixture of awe and disbelief. "We shouldn't go too far," Lily cautioned, reaching for her water bottle. "They're saying the drought could make the fire risk critical by evening." Emma nodded, glancing up at the sky. It was a perfect blue, unmarred by clouds, but there was something in the air. A stillness, a waiting. She'd felt it building for days. "Just to the creek and back," she promised. "Mom and Dad are on edge already with the fire warnings. Dad nearly didn't let me out today." They walked in companionable silence for a while, the forest alive around them with the sounds of summer, birds calling, insects humming, the occasional rustle of a small animal moving through the underbrush. Emma had always felt more at home here than anywhere else, as if the forest recognized her somehow. As they neared Crystal Creek, a strange scent caught Emma's attention. Not the fresh, clean smell of water or the green scent of pine needles baking in the sun, but something acrid, smoke. "Do you smell that?" she asked, stopping suddenly. Lily frowned, lifting her nose to the air. Smoke? But the fire warning was for tonight, not... A distant crackle interrupted her words, followed by the unmistakable sound of wood splintering. Emma's heart raced as she spun toward the noise. Through the trees she could see it, an orange glow, spreading rapidly along the ridge to the north. "Fire!" she breathed, fear clenching her stomach. "It's coming from the direction of the cabin." Without waiting for Lily, Emma broke into a run, darting down the trail with the speed and surety of someone who knew every root and rock by heart. Behind her, she could hear Lily calling her name, but panic drove her forward. The smoke thickened as she approached the cabin clearing, stinging her eyes and scratching at her throat. Through the haze, she could make out her parents on the porch, tossing buckets of water onto the advancing flames that were already consuming the woodshed. "Emma!" her father shouted when he saw her. "Get back! The wind changed. The fire's spreading too fast." Sarah rushed toward her daughter, her face streaked with soot. "Where's Lily? Is she with you?" "She's just behind me." Emma gasped, coughing as a wave of smoke washed over them. "Dad, what happened?" Jack Thomas shook his head grimly. "Lightning strike on the north ridge. It's been so dry that it spread instantly. The rangers are calling for evacuation of the whole valley." As if to emphasize his words, a massive pine at the forest's edge crackled and then collapsed in a shower of sparks, sending a wall of heat rushing toward them. The fire had now encircled half the clearing, turning the familiar forest into a hellscape of orange flames and black smoke. "We need to go now," Sarah shouted over the roar of the fire. "The car's packed. Lily can come with us." Emma spun around, expecting to see her friend emerging from the trail. But the path remained empty, the smoke now so thick it was difficult to see more than a few yards. "She was right behind me," Emma said, dread rising in her chest. She must have gotten lost in the smoke. Before her parents could stop her, Emma darted back toward the trail, pulling her t-shirt up over her nose and mouth. The heat was intense, the air shimmering with it. "Emma!" Sarah screamed, but Jack held her back. "It's too dangerous," he said, his voice breaking. "We have to trust she knows the forest." Emma raced down the trail, calling Lily's name until her throat was raw from smoke and shouting. The fire was everywhere now, jumping from tree to tree with terrifying speed. Branches crashed down around her, and twice she had to change direction to avoid walls of flame that sprang up in her path. "Lily!" she called again, desperation making her voice crack. "Lily, where are you?" A faint cry answered her, barely audible over the fire's roar. Emma spun toward the sound, leaving the trail and plunging into the underbrush. 20 yards into the forest, she found Lily sprawled on the ground, her ankle bent at an unnatural angle. "I fell," Lily sobbed as Emma dropped to her knees beside her. "I tried to follow you, but I couldn't see in the smoke, and—" "It's okay," Emma said, though they both knew it wasn't. The fire was closing in around them, cutting off the path back to the cabin. "Can you stand?" Lily tried, leaning heavily on Emma's shoulder, but collapsed with a cry of pain as soon as she put weight on her injured ankle. "I can't," she gasped. "Emma, you need to go. Get help." "I'm not leaving you," Emma said fiercely, looking around for another escape route. The smoke was so thick now she could barely see, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Each breath felt like inhaling fire. For the first time in her life, Emma felt truly afraid of the forest that had always been her home. It was as if the wilderness itself had turned against them, transformed from sanctuary to death trap in the space of minutes. Then, through the curtain of smoke, Emma saw something moving toward them, something large and dark, pushing through the burning underbrush with deliberate steps. Her heart nearly stopped. A grizzly bear emerged from the smoke, its massive form silhouetted against the flames. It was enormous, its fur silvered with age, its dark eyes reflecting the orange glow of the fire. A jagged scar marred its right front paw, an old wound long healed but still visible. Lily screamed, pressing herself against Emma in terror. "Oh my God," she whimpered. "We're going to die." But Emma remained still, staring at the bear with a strange sense of recognition. Something about its eyes, about the way it held itself as it regarded them. "It's okay," she whispered, though she had no rational reason to believe it was. "It's not going to hurt us." The bear huffed, pawing at the ground as it continued to watch them. Then, to Emma's astonishment, it turned and took a few steps away before looking back, as if waiting. "I think it wants us to follow it," Emma said, her voice hushed with disbelief. "Are you crazy?" Lily hissed. "That's a grizzly bear, Emma. It probably just wants an easy meal." But Emma was already helping Lily to her feet, supporting her weight as they took a tentative step toward the bear. Something deep inside her, something she couldn't explain, told her this was their only chance. The bear watched them approach, then turned and began moving slowly through the forest, choosing a path where the fire had not yet reached. Emma and Lily followed, Lily leaning heavily on Emma's shoulder, her face pale with pain and fear. "I can't believe we're following a bear," Lily whispered as they stumbled after the massive creature. "This is insane." "Trust me," Emma said, though her own heart was racing with a mixture of fear and something else, something that felt almost like recognition. I think it's trying to help us." The bear led them through the burning forest, selecting paths where the fire was less intense or had not yet reached. Twice it stopped to allow them to catch up, waiting patiently as Lily struggled forward on her injured ankle. Once, when a burning branch crashed down directly in their path, the bear actually pushed it aside with its massive paw, clearing the way for them. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, they emerged from the forest onto the shore of Blackwater Lake. The bear stopped at the water's edge, turning to look at Emma one last time. In its dark eyes, she saw something impossible. Intelligence, purpose, and what could only be described as recognition. "Thank you," Emma whispered, the words feeling both ridiculous and completely right. The bear huffed softly, then turned and disappeared back into the smoke-filled forest, leaving Emma and Lily standing on the safety of the lakeshore. In the distance, they could hear the wail of sirens as firefighters and rangers raced to combat the growing inferno. "What just happened?" Lily asked, her voice shaking as she sank down onto the rocky shore. "Did a bear just save us?" Emma stared at the spot where the bear had vanished, her mind reeling with the implications of what had just occurred. "Not just any bear," she said slowly. I think it was the same bear from when I was a baby, the one my mom always told me about." "That's impossible," Lily said, but without conviction. "That was 15 years ago. Bears don't live that long, do they? And they definitely don't remember people." Emma shook her head, unable to explain the certainty she felt. "This one did," she said simply. "It remembered me." Hours later, after they had been found by rangers and reunited with their frantic parents, after Lily's ankle had been splinted at the emergency evacuation center and the full extent of the wildfire's devastation had become clear, Emma sat quietly on the steps of the community hall that had been transformed into a shelter for those displaced by the fire. Sarah joined her, wrapping a blanket around her daughter's shoulders. "The rangers say our cabin is gone," she said softly. "The fire took everything." Emma nodded, numb with exhaustion and the overwhelming events of the day. "I know. Dad told me." Sarah studied her daughter's face in the fading light. "He also told me how you got to the lake, about the bear." Emma tensed, expecting disbelief or concern for her mental state. But Sarah simply took her hand, squeezing it gently. "What did it look like?" she asked. "This bear that led you to safety?" "Old," Emma said, the image clear in her mind. "Silver around the muzzle, and it had a scar on its right front paw, like an old injury that never quite healed properly." Sarah's breath caught. Tears filled her eyes as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small glass jar, one of the few items she had grabbed when fleeing the cabin. Inside was a tuft of coarse brown fur, preserved for 15 years. "I always knew," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Somehow, I always knew your paths would cross again." Emma took the jar, turning it in her hands as the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "It was the same bear, wasn't it? The one from when I was a baby?" Sarah nodded, wiping away tears. "I think so. I don't know how or why, but yes, I believe it was." "But why would it help us? Why would it remember after all these years?" Sarah looked out toward the forest, where smoke still rose from the burning trees. "Some bonds transcend understanding," she said simply. "What happened between you and that bear as a baby, it was extraordinary, beyond explanation. And today it repaid the debt it felt it owed." Later that night, as evacuees huddled in the community hall and firefighters continued to battle the blaze that had consumed much of Blackwater Forest, a ranger brought news that lifted a weight from Emma's heart. A wildlife monitoring station on the far side of the lake had captured footage of a massive male grizzly swimming across Blackwater Lake, away from the fire. The bear had reached the safety of the northern ridge, where the fire had not yet spread. "Bears are smarter than we give them credit for," the ranger told Emma, unaware of the significance of his news. "They can sense danger and know how to escape it, This old guy is probably halfway to the high country by now." Emma smiled, relief flooding through her. As the community struggled to come to terms with the devastation of the fire, as families mourned homes lost and lives uprooted, she held tight to the one bright spot in the darkness. Somewhere out there, the bear that had twice now played a role in her life was safe. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the story of Emma Thomas and the grizzly bear of Blackwater Forest was far from over. That, in the years to come, as the burned forest slowly regenerated and life returned to the scorched landscape, the paths of a young woman and an aging bear would cross once more. And when they did, it would not be chance or coincidence that brought them together, but something deeper, a connection forged in one extraordinary moment 15 years earlier, when a baby's innocence had touched something ancient and wild, creating a bond that neither time nor fire could destroy. 3 years later, the new Thomas cabin stood on the same spot as the old one, though it was larger and sturdier than its predecessor. Jack had insisted on stone walls and a metal roof this time. "Nothing that can burn," he'd said, the memory of the wildfire still fresh even after 3 years. Emma sat on the porch steps, her college acceptance letters spread out before her. Stanford, UC Berkeley, Colorado State, all offering scholarships to the girl whose story had, improbably, gone national after the fire. The Bear Girl of Blackwater Forest, the media had dubbed her after Lily's tearful interview about their miraculous rescue had gone viral. Wildlife experts had debated the plausibility of her story. Conservationists had used it to argue for stronger protections for grizzly habitat. Skeptics had dismissed it as mass hysteria induced by smoke inhalation and fear. But those who knew Emma, who had witnessed her quiet connection to the forest and its creatures, believed. Sarah emerged from the cabin, a steaming mug in each hand. "Tea?" she said, offering one to Emma. "Have you decided yet?" Emma took the mug gratefully, inhaling the familiar scent of chamomile. "I'm thinking Colorado State," she said. "Their wildlife biology program is amazing, and it's not too far from home." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. Since the fire, Emma's path had become clear to her. She wanted to work with wildlife, to study the complex relationships between humans and the creatures with whom they shared the world, to understand what had happened between her and a certain grizzly bear. "Your father will be pleased," Sarah said, settling beside her daughter. "He worries about you going too far from home." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the regenerating forest in shades of gold and amber. In the 3 years since the fire, nature had begun its slow process of renewal. Young saplings pushed up through blackened earth. Wildlife had cautiously returned to the recovering ecosystem. Life went on, as it always did. "Have there been any more sightings?" Emma asked, though she knew the answer. She asked the same question every few months, unable to let go of her concern for the bear that had saved her life. Sarah shook her head. "Not for over a year now. The last confirmed sighting was near Raven Peak, heading into the wilderness area. The rangers say a bear that old would be nearing the end of its natural lifespan." Emma nodded, trying to ignore the pang of sadness the thought brought. She had hoped somehow to see the bear one more time before leaving for college, to find some closure to the strange connection that had shaped her life in ways she was still discovering. "I'm going for a walk," she said suddenly, setting down her mug. "Just to the creek and back before dark." Sarah's expression showed a flicker of concern. She had never quite shaken the fear that had gripped her during the fire, but she nodded. "Take your phone and be back before full dark." The familiar trail to Crystal Creek had changed since the fire, but Emma navigated it easily, noting the signs of recovery with each step. Where once tall pines had stood, now aspens and birches reached toward the sky, their leaves shimmering in the evening light. The understory was dense with new growth, a tangle of raspberry bushes and wildflowers that had seized the opportunity created by the fire's destruction. At the creek, Emma sat on a flat rock, dangling her feet in the cool water. This had been her thinking spot for as long as she could remember, the place she came when decisions needed to be made or emotions processed. Tonight, with the weight of her future pressing down on her, she needed the peace only this place could provide. The snap of a twig across the creek brought her attention sharply back to the present. Emma tensed, scanning the opposite bank for movement. The shadows beneath the trees were deepening as the sun slipped lower, making it difficult to distinguish shapes in the gathering dusk. Then she saw it. A massive form moving slowly through the new growth on the far side of the creek. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the silver-muzzled grizzly bear that had twice now played a pivotal role in her life. It looked older, more gaunt than she remembered, moving with the careful deliberation of an animal feeling the weight of its years. But its dark eyes were as alert and intelligent as ever as it regarded her across the flowing water. "Hello, old friend," Emma said softly, remaining perfectly still on her rock. The bear huffed softly, lowering its massive head to drink from the creek. It seemed unconcerned by her presence, as if meeting a human here was the most natural thing in the world. As it drank, Emma could clearly see the scar on its right paw, the legacy of the trap that had started their improbable connection 18 years earlier. For 20 minutes, they shared the space in peaceful coexistence, the bear grazing on berries along the creek bank, while Emma watched in wonder. No words were spoken, no dramatic gestures made, but Emma felt something profound passing between them, an acknowledgement of the bond they shared, a recognition that transcended the usual boundaries between human and wild. As twilight deepened toward true dark, the bear finally turned to leave, moving back toward the deeper forest with unhurried steps. At the edge of the trees, it paused, looking back at Emma one last time. "Goodbye," she whispered, a lump forming in her throat. Somehow she knew with absolute certainty that this would be their final meeting, that the old bear had come to say farewell before retreating to the wilderness to live out its remaining days. The bear huffed softly as if in response, then disappeared into the shadows beneath the trees. Emma remained on her rock until full dark, tears streaming silently down her face, not from sadness but from the overwhelming sense of having been part of something miraculous, something that defied explanation but was nonetheless real. When she finally returned to the cabin, Sarah took one look at her daughter's face and knew. "You saw it again," she said, not a question but a statement. Emma nodded, unable to find words for the experience she had just had. Sarah embraced her, understanding without need for explanation. "Some things in this world remain mysteries," she said softly, "and maybe that's as it should be." 6 months later, as Emma prepared to leave for college, a package arrived from Ranger Dale Miller, who had retired the previous year. Inside was a simple wooden frame containing a photograph captured by a remote wildlife camera in the high alpine region of the wilderness area. The image showed a massive grizzly bear standing in a meadow of summer wildflowers, its silver-muzzled face turned toward the camera as if it knew it was being observed. On the back, Dale had written a simple note. "Thought you should have this. Last confirmed sighting, June 15th. The old fellow looks at peace, doesn't he? Some stories, it seems, do have happy endings." Emma hung the photograph in her dorm room at Colorado State, and later in her office when she became a wildlife biologist specializing in bear behavior and conservation. It served as a daily reminder of the extraordinary connection she had experienced, and of the thin veil that separates the human world from the wild one just beyond. In the years that followed, as she worked to protect the creatures that shared the recovering Blackwater forest, Emma often found herself telling the story of a baby and a bear to skeptical colleagues and wide-eyed schoolchildren alike. Some believed her, some didn't. It didn't matter. She knew the truth. And somewhere in the collective memory of the grizzly bears that roamed the wilderness, passed down through generations in ways humans couldn't begin to understand, the story lived on as well. Of a small human with gentle hands who once freed a trapped bear, and of the bond that formed between them, transcending the natural order and touching something ancient and profound in them both. It was a story that, like the forest itself, would continue to grow and evolve long after those who had lived it were gone. A testament to the unexpected connections that can form between the most unlikely of companions, and to the capacity for compassion that exists in all living things, even those we think of as wild and untamable. In the end, that was the true miracle of what had happened between Emma Thomas and the grizzly bear of Blackwater Forest. Not that a bear had spared a human child, or that it had later saved her from a fire, but that for a brief moment the divide between human and wild had been bridged by something as simple and powerful as compassion. And in that bridge, both had found something precious, a connection that reminded them of what it truly means to be alive in a world full of wonders. 12 years later, the presentation screen at the International Wildlife Conservation Conference in Vancouver displayed a striking image, an aerial photograph of Blackwater Forest, the burn scars from the fire 15 years earlier now barely visible beneath new growth. Emma Thomas, now 30 years old and an established wildlife biologist, pointed to the image with a laser pointer. "This is resilience," she said to the packed auditorium. "Not just the forest's ability to regenerate after devastation, but the resilience of the ecosystem's relationships. The intricate connections between species that allow a balanced recovery." Her audience, a mix of scientists, conservationists, and policymakers from around the world, listened attentively. Emma had become something of a celebrity in conservation circles over the past decade. Her groundbreaking research on interspecies communication and empathy in large predators had challenged conventional wisdom and opened new avenues for conservation efforts. "What we're learning," Emma continued, advancing to the next slide, a map dotted with colored markers representing bear populations throughout the Pacific Northwest, "is that these animals possess far greater emotional and cognitive complexity than we've previously acknowledged. Their capacity for memory, for recognition, even for what we might cautiously term gratitude, has significant implications for how we approach conservation and human-wildlife conflict mitigation." In the front row, Sarah Thomas watched her daughter with pride. At 58, Sarah's hair had silvered, but her eyes still held the same sharp intelligence and warmth they always had. Jack sat beside her. His weathered face creased in a permanent smile as he watched Emma command the room with quiet authority. "The Blackwater Bear study that my team has conducted over the past 8 years has documented multiple instances of bears avoiding conflict with humans, even when their territories overlap significantly," Emma explained. "This suggests a level of learned behavior, and possibly even intergenerational knowledge transfer that we're only beginning to understand." What Emma didn't mention, what she never mentioned in her professional presentations, was the personal experience that had driven her research. The story of her encounters with the silver-muzzled bear had remained private, shared only with close family and friends. In scientific circles, anecdotes were not evidence, and Emma had worked too hard to build her professional reputation to risk it on a story many would dismiss as childhood fantasy or emotional projection. After the presentation, as attendees mingled during the coffee break, a tall man with steel-gray hair approached Emma, His conference badge identified him as Dr. Nikolai Volkov, director of the Siberian Tiger Conservation Project. Dr. Thomas, he said, his Russian accent subtle but present. A fascinating presentation. Your work on interspecies empathy parallels some observations we've made with tiger populations in the Sikhote-Alin Mountains. Emma shook his hand, intrigued. I'd love to hear more about that. The cognitive and emotional lives of large predators remain so understudied. Perhaps we could discuss it over dinner, Dr. Volkov suggested. My team has documented several cases of tigers exhibiting what appears to be recognition behavior with specific human individuals over extended periods. Your bear study methodology might be applicable to our work. Before Emma could respond, her research assistant, Tyler Chen, hurried over, his face tight with concern. Emma, sorry to interrupt, he said, but there's a situation back at Blackwater. Ranger Patel just called. They found a bear in a culvert trap near the new visitor center, and they're requesting your presence before they relocate it. Emma frowned. Bear trapping and relocation was routine in areas where human-bear conflict occurred, but it wasn't usually something that required her specific expertise. Did Mina say why they need me there? Tyler glanced nervously at Dr. Volkov, then back to Emma. She said you'd want to see this one. It's a female grizzly, approximately 20 years old, with unusual markings. She has what appears to be a silver crescent on her chest, and he hesitated, lowering his voice. She has a cub with her, a cub with a distinctive white patch over its right eye. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The description matched exactly the markings of the two bears that had been central to her research for the past 3 years. Bears she had named Stella and Patch in her field notes, but had come to think of privately as Luna and Scout. That's impossible, she said, her professional demeanor momentarily slipping. Luna and Scout's territory is 40 miles north of the visitor center. They've never ventured that close to human structures before. Dr. Volkov observed the exchange with interest. I take it these are bears you've been studying closely? Emma nodded, her mind racing. Yes, part of our long-term behavioral study. Their sudden presence near the visitor center is highly unusual. Perhaps, Dr. Volkov suggested, they have come looking for something. Or someone. The comment, innocuous as it seemed, sent a chill down Emma's spine. Over the years, she had been careful not to anthropomorphize the animals she studied, to maintain scientific objectivity despite her personal history. But there had been moments during her fieldwork. A bear's prolonged gaze, a pattern of movement that seemed to acknowledge her presence without aggression or fear, that attested that professional distance. I need to get back, Emma said. Decision made. Dr. Volkov, I apologize, but we'll have to postpone our dinner. Tyler, can you handle the afternoon roundtable session? I'll take the next flight to Pinecrest. Sarah, who had been listening from a few feet away, approached her daughter. I'm coming with you, she said, in a tone that brooked no argument. Jack can handle things here. 3 hours later, as their small chartered plane began its descent toward Pinecrest Regional Airport, Emma stared out the window at Blackwater Forest stretching below them. From this height, the burn scars from the fire 15 years earlier were barely visible, the forest having healed itself in the way nature always did, given time and space. Do you think it's possible? Sarah asked quietly, breaking the silence that had fallen between them since takeoff. That these bears might be connected to him? Emma didn't pretend to misunderstand. Even after all these years, the silver-muzzled bear that had saved her life remained a presence in their family consciousness, a shared experience that had shaped them all in different ways. It's been 15 years since the fire, Emma said, scientific caution warring with an intuition she couldn't quite suppress. That bear would be well past the normal lifespan for a wild grizzly, if he's even still alive. And for Luna to be his offspring, the timing could work. But the probability is extremely low. Sarah smiled, recognizing her daughter's careful scientific language. The way she qualified her statements, never claiming certainty where data was insufficient. "But you still wonder," she said. It wasn't a question. Emma nodded, returning her gaze to the forest below. "I still wonder." At the Blackwater Forest Visitor Center, a tense scene awaited them. The parking lot had been cleared of tourists, and a perimeter of yellow caution tape surrounded the culvert trap. A large metal cylinder with a trapdoor mechanism positioned near the edge of the woods. Forest Service personnel and 2 state wildlife officers stood in a loose circle around the trap, their expressions a mixture of concern and confusion. Ranger Meena Patel, who had taken over after Dale Miller's retirement, broke away from the group when she spotted Emma and Sarah approaching. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, relief evident in her voice. "We've got a situation here that's, well, it's not following standard protocols." "Tell me what happened," Emma said, slipping easily into her professional role, despite the personal undercurrents that had brought her here. Meena led them toward the trap, talking rapidly. Female Grizzly and a cub approached the visitor center around dawn. Not aggressive, but too close for comfort with the summer tourist season starting. We set up the culvert trap with the standard bait, and they went in without hesitation around noon. "That's unusual," Emma noted. Wild bears, especially females with cubs, typically showed extreme caution around human structures and artificial objects like traps. "It gets weirder," Meena continued. "Once trapped, most bears panic. They vocalize, try to escape. This female has been completely calm. She's just waiting." The cub follows her lead. "We were going to tranquilize and relocate them to the North Wilderness section as per protocol, but then someone recognized the markings from your research publications." They reached the trap, and Emma knelt to peer through the small observation window cut into the metal. Inside, illuminated by the shaft of light from the window, a large female grizzly sat calmly, her cub nestled against her side. The silver crescent-shaped marking on her chest was unmistakable, as was the white patch over the cub's right eye. "Luna," Emma whispered, using the bear's study name even though she knew it was unprofessional. "And Scout." The female bear's head turned at the sound of Emma's voice, her dark eyes fixing on the window with an intensity that made Emma's heart race. There was recognition there. Unmistakable, impossible recognition. "She knows you," Sarah said softly, kneeling beside her daughter. Emma stood abruptly, scientific training reasserting itself. "That's projection," she said, though without conviction. "Bears have excellent sense of smell. She's likely responding to familiar human scents, not recognizing me personally." But as she turned to discuss relocation options with Meena, a soft huffing sound from the trap caught her attention. It was the same sound she had heard 15 years earlier, when an aging bear had said goodbye to her at Crystal Creek. "The transport truck will be here in about an hour," Meena was saying. "Standard procedure is to tranquilize before moving. But given that this is a female from your study population, I wanted your input on how to minimize stress during relocation." Emma nodded absently, her mind working through the facts, the possibilities, the improbabilities of the situation. Luna and Scout had been part of her observational study for 3 years. In that time, they had never approached human structures, had maintained a consistent territory in the northern section of the forest, had shown typical wild bear behavior in every respect. Except for one thing. On 3 separate occasions, Luna had made direct eye contact with Emma during field observations, holding her gaze for an unusually long time before deliberately turning away. Each time, Emma had noted it in her field journal as unusual interactive behavior, but had been careful not to overinterpret. Now, with Luna and her cub inexplicably trapped at the visitor center, those moments took on new significance. "I need to make a decision here," Mina prompted gently. "Transport is on the way. What's your recommendation as the project lead?" Emma took a deep breath, scientific caution warring with a certainty she felt in her bones. "Let me go in," she said finally. The reaction was immediate and unified. "Absolutely not," Mina said firmly. "Emma, no," Sarah gasped. The wildlife officers exchanged alarmed glances. "Hear me out," Emma said, raising her hands placatingly. "This bear and her cub are part of my long-term behavioral study. Their presence here is highly unusual, and forced relocation could disrupt important research data. I want to approach them in a controlled way before we make decisions about relocation." "It's against every protocol we have," Mina argued. "A female with a cub is the most dangerous bear configuration possible, no matter how docile she seems right now." "I understand the risks," Emma insisted, "but I also understand these specific bears. I've observed them in the field for 3 years. If there's any human they would tolerate direct contact with, it's me." The discussion continued for several minutes, growing increasingly heated as Emma held firm against the united front of safety protocols and established wildlife management practices. In the end, it was Sarah who broke the impasse. "Let her try," she said quietly. "My daughter has a connection with these animals that goes beyond scientific observation. I know how that sounds, but I've witnessed it firsthand." Mina looked between mother and daughter, weighing decades of professional training against the conviction in their faces. "If I allow this, and I'm not saying I will, we do it with every possible safety measure in place. Tranquilizer guns ready, escape route clear, protective gear, the works." Emma nodded, relief flooding through her. "Thank you." 20 minutes later, dressed in reinforced protective clothing and with tranquilizer teams positioned strategically around the trap, Emma stood before the trap door. Her heart hammered in her chest, adrenaline sharpening her senses despite her outward calm. "We'll open the door on your signal," Mina said, tension evident in every line of her body. "At the first sign of aggression, we tranquilize and you back away. No heroics. Clear?" "Clear," Emma agreed, though they both knew that if Luna charged, there would be precious little time for retreat. Emma took a deep breath, centering herself the way she did during field observations. Then she nodded to Mina, who gave the signal to the operator controlling the trapdoor mechanism. With a metallic groan, the door began to rise slowly. Emma stood perfectly still, hands relaxed at her sides, gaze fixed on the darkened interior of the trap. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a movement in the shadows, Luna's massive form-shifting position, Scout pressed close against her side. The female Grizzly emerged cautiously into the light, her powerful shoulders rolling with each step, her head low, but not in an aggressive posture. She stopped just inside the door, nostrils flaring as she scented the air, dark eyes fixed on Emma. Around them, Emma was distantly aware of the tranquilizer team's tensing, of Sarah's sharp intake of breath, of Mina murmuring into her radio. But her focus remained entirely on Luna, on the silent communication passing between woman and bear in that frozen moment. Then Luna did something that defied everything the assembled wildlife professionals expected. She huffed softly, nudged her cub forward, and sat back on her haunches in a posture of complete non-aggression. Scout, emboldened by his mother's behavior, took a tentative step toward Emma, his curiosity evident in the tilt of his small head. He was young, perhaps 6 months old, his fuzzy coat making him appear deceptively cuddly, despite the sharp claws and teeth he already possessed. "Easy," Emma murmured, not to the bears, but to the tranquilizer team she could sense preparing to fire. "They're not threatening. They're communicating." Moving with deliberate slowness, Emma crouched down to the cub's level, maintaining eye contact with Luna to ensure the mother bear remained comfortable with the interaction. Scout approached with the boundless curiosity of the young, sniffing Emma's outstretched hand with interest. Behind her, Emma heard Mina whisper incredulously, "I've never seen anything like this. Never." The cub, apparently satisfied with his inspection, turned and ambled back to his mother. Luna huffed again, then slowly, deliberately, turned her massive head toward the north, the direction of the— "That's not how this works," one of the wildlife officers said, confusion evident in his voice. "Bears don't request specific relocation sites." But Emma wasn't listening. A new realization was dawning on her, a connection she should have made immediately, but had been too caught up in the immediate situation to see. "The logging proposal," she said, turning to Mina. "The one that would open the northern wilderness section to limited commercial logging. The public comment period ends tomorrow, doesn't it?" Mina nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes as well. "Yes, the Forest Service is expected to approve it, since there hasn't been significant opposition. The economic benefits for the county are substantial." Emma turned back to Luna, who continued to gaze at her with those intelligent dark eyes. "That's their home," she said softly. "That's what this is about." Later, after Luna and Scout had been safely transported back to their territory in the northern wilderness, without tranquilizers, with Emma riding in the transport truck alongside them, the story of their extraordinary behavior began to spread through the scientific community and beyond. Emma found herself at the center of a media storm, her careful scientific reputation suddenly overshadowed by viral videos of her crouching before a wild grizzly bear and its cub. To some, she became a modern-day Dr. Doolittle. To others, a reckless researcher endangering the proper distance between humans and wild animals. But to those who mattered, the Forest Service Committee reviewing the logging proposal, the county commissioners weighing economic benefits against conservation values, the residents of Pinecrest who had grown up with the legend of the Bear Girl of Blackwater Forest. Emma's unprecedented interaction with Luna and Scout became something more significant. Evidence that the relationship between humans and the wild was more complex, more nuanced, and perhaps more sacred than they had previously acknowledged. 2 months later, as Emma and Sarah sat on the porch of the Thomas cabin watching the sunset paint the forest in shades of gold and amber, a letter arrived from the Forest Service. The northern wilderness area, including Luna and Scout's territory, had been designated as a special conservation zone. Commercial logging would not be permitted. "They listened," Sarah said, reading the letter over Emma's shoulder. "Your bears made them listen." Emma smiled, her gaze drifting toward the deepening shadows beneath the trees. "Not my bears," she corrected gently. "Their own bears, with their own purposes and intelligences that we're only beginning to understand." A soft breeze stirred the pine needles, carrying with it the scents and sounds of the forest preparing for night. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, Emma knew Luna and Scout were going about their bearish business, foraging, playing, teaching and learning the ways of the wilderness that was their birthright. And perhaps, somewhere deeper in that same wilderness, in a secluded den lined with soft grasses and pine boughs, an ancient silver-muzzled bear watched over them all, his legacy living on in the extraordinary connection that had formed between his descendants and the human child he had once spared. A connection that had, in the end, helped save the forest they all called home. 30 years later, the winter storm had blanketed Blackwater Forest in 3 feet of snow, transforming the landscape into a monochrome wonderland of white ground and black tree trunks. Emma Thomas, now in her 60s, her once auburn hair streaked with silver, made her way carefully along the plowed path from her cabin to the small research outpost she had established decades earlier at the forest's edge. Despite numerous offers from prestigious universities and research institutions over the years, Emma had chosen to remain close to Blackwater Forest. Her groundbreaking work on Ursid cognition and interspecies empathy could be conducted from anywhere, she had reasoned, and her heart had never truly left these woods. The small complex that housed the Blackwater Wilderness Research Center had grown from a single trailer to a cluster of environmentally sensitive buildings nestled among the trees. Young researchers came from around the world to study under Dr. Emma Thomas, whose methodologies had revolutionized wildlife conservation practices globally. Most were drawn not just by her scientific credentials, but by the legend that surrounded her, the woman who spoke the language of bears. Emma had never encouraged this mythology, maintaining always that her approach was based on rigorous observation and data collection. But neither had she discouraged the sense of reverence her students developed for the forest and its inhabitants. Sometimes, she reflected, a little wonder was as important to conservation as scientific knowledge. Inside the main research building, warmth enveloped her as she stamped snow from her boots. The central room hummed with activity. Graduate students analyzing data, mapping territories, reviewing camera trap footage. They greeted her with the easy respect they always showed, stepping aside as she made her way to her small office at the rear of the building. Lily Morgan Chen waited there, her once dark hair now as silver as Emma's, her face creased with smile lines that spoke of a life well lived. After their dramatic rescue from the fire 45 years earlier, Lily had never lost her connection to Emma or to Blackwater Forest. She had married Tyler Chen, Emma's former research assistant, and together they had raised 3 children while pursuing their own careers in environmental education. The board approved it, Lily announced without preamble, as Emma closed the office door. Unanimous vote. The Emma Thomas Wilderness Protection Act will be signed into law next month. Emma sank into her chair, emotion washing over her. The legislation would permanently protect not just Blackwater Forest, but a corridor of wilderness stretching from the Canadian border to Northern California, critical habitat for the grizzly populations she had studied throughout her career. "I never thought I'd see it happen," she admitted, her voice thick. "Not in my lifetime." Lily smiled, reaching across the desk to squeeze her friend's hand. Who would have thought that being trapped in a forest fire as teenagers would lead to this? If that bear hadn't led us to safety. They shared a moment of silent remembrance for the silver-muzzled bear that had changed the course of both their lives that day. Over the decades, Emma had documented multiple instances of unusual bear behavior in Blackwater Forest. Behaviors that suggested recognition, memory, and what could only be described as intentionality. Her data had been rigorous enough, her methodology sound enough, that even the most skeptical colleagues had eventually been forced to acknowledge that there was something unique about the Ursid population in this specific ecosystem. A knock at the door interrupted their reflective moment. Maya Thomas Patel, Emma's grandniece and the youngest member of the research team at 24, poked her head in. "Aunt Emma, sorry to interrupt, but there's something on the Northridge camera trap you need to see." Emma exchanged a glance with Lily. The North Ridge was the site of Scout's territory. Scout, who was now the aging patriarch of a thriving bear family, his distinctive white eye patch having faded somewhat with age but still visible in good light. In the monitoring room, Maya pulled up the footage on the main screen. The timestamp showed it had been recorded just after dawn that morning. Snow fell heavily around a large gray boulder that both women recognized as a prominent landmark on the ridge. For several seconds, nothing moved except the swirling snowflakes. Then a bear appeared, an enormous male grizzly, moving with the deliberate grace of a mature adult in his prime. His coat was unusual, silvered around the muzzle and chest despite his clearly powerful physique suggesting he was in the prime of life, not elderly. As he approached the camera, he stopped, rising slightly on his hind legs to sniff the air. Then, with what almost looked like deliberate intent, he turned to face the camera directly. Emma's breath caught. The bear's right front paw bore a distinctive white marking, a perfect crescent shape on the pad, visible clearly as he placed it in the snow. "That's Crescent," Maya said, excitement in her voice. "Scout's youngest son, but look at his coloring. I've never seen a bear his age with that kind of silver markings before." Emma said nothing, her eyes fixed on the screen, on the bear's intelligent gaze seeming to look directly into the camera, directly at her. "There's more," Maya said, fast-forwarding the footage slightly. As the snowfall intensified, a second bear entered the frame, smaller, female, with a cub at her side. The cub was tiny, likely born the previous spring, and its coat bore distinctive markings, silver around the muzzle, and a perfect white crescent on its right front paw, matching Crescent's marking. "That's Luna," Lily whispered, using the name that had been passed down through generations of researchers to the female descendants of the original Luna. "And her new cub." The three bears converged near the boulder, greeting each other with the gentle huffs and body language of related bears comfortable in each other's presence. Then, as if responding to some silent signal, they all turned to face the camera. The tableau they presented, large male, female, and cub, all bearing distinctive markings that linked them across generations to the bears that had changed Emma's life, was so perfect it almost seemed staged. "It's like they're posing for a family portrait," Maya said, the scientific detachment she usually maintained momentarily forgotten in wonder. Emma felt tears prick her eyes as she watched the bears on screen. In her decades of research, she had documented the lineage of Blackwater's bears through multiple generations, tracing the distinctive markings and behaviors through time. What had begun with a wounded bear trapped in a snare and freed by a baby's innocent kindness had evolved into something profound. A multi-generational relationship between two species that conventional science would have declared impossible. The bears on screen began to move away, disappearing one by one into the swirling snow. Just before the footage ended, the cub turned back, looking directly into the camera with a curiosity and intelligence that seemed to transcend its young age. "They know," Emma said softly, placing her hand on the screen as the cub's image froze in the final frame. "Somehow, they know about the Protection Act." In another context, such a statement would have been dismissed as anthropomorphism or sentimentality. But here, among those who had devoted their lives to understanding the complex intelligence of these magnificent creatures, it was received with solemn nods of agreement. Later that evening, as Emma sat alone on her cabin porch despite the cold, watching moonlight illuminate the snow-covered forest, she reflected on the long, improbable journey that had brought her to this moment. From a baby's chance encounter with a trapped bear to international legislation protecting vast swaths of wilderness, a connection that had rippled outward through time, touching countless lives, human and animal alike. The snow crunched softly as something large moved at the forest's edge. Emma remained perfectly still, her breath fogging in the cold air as a massive shape emerged from between the trees. Crescent, his silver markings gleaming in the moonlight, stood at the boundary where forest met clearing, his dark eyes fixed on her with unmistakable recognition. "Hello, old friend," Emma said softly, as she had said to his ancestor so many years before. The bear huffed softly in response, a sound that carried clearly through the still winter air. For a long moment they regarded each other across the distance, woman and bear, civilization and wilderness, each acknowledging the invisible bond that connected them. Then, with a grace that belied his enormous size, Crescent turned and disappeared back into the forest that was now protected, in part, because of the understanding Emma had gained from his ancestors, an understanding that had, over decades, expanded to encompass not just bears but humans as well, teaching them to see the wild not as something to be conquered or feared, but as something to be respected and preserved. As Emma watched the space where the bear had stood, snow filling in his massive tracks, she thought of the baby she had once been, reaching out to touch a wounded bear with no concept of danger, only with pure compassion. How that single moment of connection had rippled outward through time, touching lives and changing perspectives across decades. Some bonds transcend understanding, Sarah had told her once. Some connections form in those rare moments when the veil between human and wild grows thin enough to touch through. In the end, that was the true miracle of what had happened between the Thomas family and the bears of Blackwater Forest across 3 generations. Not the dramatic rescues or the scientific breakthroughs, but the simple, profound recognition of kinship between species, a recognition that had, in its quiet way, helped heal the ancient divide between humans and the wilderness they had too often feared instead of cherished. And as Emma finally rose and went inside, closing her door against the winter cold, she carried with her the certainty that the story was still unfolding, that long after she was gone, the descendants of that first silver-muzzled bear would continue to watch over Blackwater Forest, and perhaps to remember the human family that had once shown kindness to their ancestor in his moment of need. Some stories have no ending, she thought as she drifted toward sleep. They simply continue, flowing like rivers through time, connecting all they touch in ways too profound for words. In the heart of Blackwater Forest, beneath a sky brilliant with stars, Crescent returned to his family, to Luna and their cub, to the other bears that shared their territory and their lineage. The protected wilderness stretched around them in all directions, safeguarded now against the encroachment that had threatened it for so long, and somewhere in the collective memory they shared, passed down through scent and behavior and the mysterious connections that humans had only begun to understand, lived the story of a small human with gentle hands who had once freed a trapped bear, and of the bond that had formed between them, a bond that had, in its way, helped save the forest they all called home. It was a story without words, carried in the blood and bone and breath of each new generation. A reminder that compassion, once offered, creates ripples that can transform the world in ways no one could possibly predict. A reminder that sometimes the most profound connections begin with the simplest acts of kindness,